I'm going to talk about the work that I've been doing for quite a few years. Try to be to the point and specific. I'm interested in communication processes in general, not only human communication, but technology and the media sort of issues, particularly the internet. And I've been studying all my academic career human interaction using the media, and with particular related to solving conflict problems. And more particular than that, political conflict, ethno-political conflicts. Those are conflicts where ethnicity and religion and those things are implicated. They're involved. They're not about those things per se. No conflict is purely ethnic. I don't know, maybe the Hutus and the Tutsis was pretty ethnic, violent conflict, but no conflict is purely ethnic, but ethnicity is involved. Secondly, I'm interested in track 2 levels or grassroots levels of work, not necessarily track 1, if you know that track 1, track 2 distinction, I'm sure you do. Not necessarily in diplomacy, but more into communities and the local environments that can use deliberative processes to solve problems, make decisions, and in the case of conflict, to bring the two sides closer, to close the gaps between them a little bit. I've been a communication and a political science professor all my life, and I'm not naive about communication processes. I don't claim that they are magical and they work quickly and easily. They don't. They're slow and difficult. But I don't think we should apologize for that. We shouldn't apologize for that because everybody working, trying to change human behavior, trying to solve conflicts, trying to make it so people can deal with each other better, everybody works in an area that is slow moving and change, is minor. I've been continuing to work with the peace processes and documents, in particular in local communities, with colleagues over the years, various colleagues in Israel, in addition to my work in the States. The deliberative process, I just had a book come out, sorry to sound sort of shameless plug, but if you're interested in these things, it just came out about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's called Deliberative Communication, and Ethno-Political Conflict. And it talks about a kind of communication that meets the criteria of what I called, truly theoretical deliberation, right? The word deliberation gets used quite a bit, and it slips a little bit between how it's used, which is okay. But in the purest sense, deliberation in its ideal sense, is a certain kind of communication that maximizes the possibility of new interests, new development, new information, and that maximizes the possibilities of solving problems productively. One of the areas that kind of deliberation really relies on is the area of argument. Deliberation in its ideal sense capitalizes on trying to identify quality arguments. And that's, I'm going to show you some data tonight on what some colleagues and I have done with respect to analyzing argument and what you can do with it, and some of the techniques for doing that. Before that, though, I want to talk about being online, and I think the internet, and I know all of you agree, has some interesting and potential useful implications, and it's able to do some things that other media can't. So, for example, it can create a public sphere. You can put people in contact with one another on the internet, and you can create a public sphere. Public sphere is that sort of place where the communication is pretty free, pretty open, pretty available. You might know that term from Habermas, if you're familiar with that philosophy, etc. The public sphere is a useful sort of thing to create so people can have contact and engage in a certain kind of communication. All right? Facebook it has been, for example, cited as as important with respect to the revolution in Tahrir Square in Egypt. We don't want to overstate that. Facebook didn't cause the revolution, and the change. But it did make a difference. It was the way people got together. It did make a difference in terms of creating an environment for a certain kind of communication. What you're able to do with internet and technology is construct new communities that you haven't done before. And as I'll say in a moment, sometimes you can construct those communities strategically. I can construct them, you know, so they're composed of certain minority groups or certain other people with a particular opinion. The public sphere on new media also creates the habits of communication, the habits of good communication. You know, if you're trying to solve problems, you know, which I'll come back to in a moment, more about what I mean by that. Well, I'll come to it right now, actually. We should make the distinction between casual political chat, the sort of thing you do at work with your friends or your neighbors. That's all fine, that's good. You learn and you participate in somebody else's, you know, ideas. But deliberation is a more pragmatic, purposeful process where you really are trying to accomplish something and trying to get something done. Deliberation has a variety, you know, of benefits, and just a few of those are allowing people to, you know, to use the phrase, participate in the intelligence of others, to get beyond what's called bounded rationality, if you know that phrase. It simply means that we're all limited within the boundaries of our own knowledge and our own abilities and our own rationality. But when I spend time interacting with you, it allows me to extend those boundaries and you to extend your boundaries. Communication can be epistemic, right? In other words, creating new knowledge. You can create new knowledge through interaction, things you didn't think of, okay? I mean, take a simple everyday example. A few people are talking about where to go to dinner, and I may know 2 or 3 places I want to go, but I'm limited to those 2 or 3 places. And the interaction, just a simple interaction that is barely even deliberative in any sense of the term, still creates new knowledge and extends the concept. You can construct representative samples on new media outlets, Facebook and things like that. You can also change and improve what are called the conditions of communicative contact. The conditions of communicative contact. One of the most basic conclusions in the research in both communication and psychology in terms of the value of communicative contact is that it has to be under the right conditions. I mean, Alport wrote about this in the 1950s, and it's been extended and elaborated on considerably since. But I mean, the conditions of contact need to be conditions of equality, conditions of evenness, conditions of respect, conditions to the best of your ability of lowering the differences and the status differences. You want to try to maximize those, you know, as much as possible. You want to try to also, which you can, using certain kinds of software that you know we're all familiar with. You can change the internet from becoming a commons to becoming a democratic space. A commons is just a place where people go and hang out and gather material, like the commons on a university campus. If I go to a website that has information on there and other people go there to that website, it's just a commons. But we can create it to a more democratic space, you know, by providing a variety of specific conditions for deliberative contact. Accessibility are issues. I'm not going to say too much about these. Technology and the like. Equality, accountability, and transparency. All of these things are part of the deliberative process. It's also very important, I think, to include diversity on deliberative groups. There's a couple of examples I can give you the citations for anyone who's interested. And at the end of the talk, if anyone happens to be particularly interested in all these issues and you want something from me, just say so. I'll email you or provide you with a variety of things that you might be interested in. But there was a very interesting deliberative experience in Haifa where the local Arabs, these were Palestinian Israelis, if that's the term we're using now, and Israeli Jews, and they were working on budget requests for the Ministry of Education for the school together, and they worked together and achieved a fair amount of deliberative quality. And I can show you these citations, you know, if you want. But diversity and differences and people from different ethnic groups, different backgrounds, different abilities, you know, et cetera, we're all constructed to be part of the process. In most of the case, using the internet to have conversations is what's called a reduced queue environment. A reduced queue environment. In other words, a maximum, in the interpersonal communication sense, a maximum queue environment is face-to-face. I can see you, you can see me, I can see everything about you, all the nonverbals, etc. Usually in the technology, the queues and the number of queues is reduced. Now that's That's subject to a lot of technology, and that's changing. For the longest time, you just typed in your answers or your responses or your interactions, and that was the end of it. But now with webcams and voice operating software, the Q environment is increasingly rich. But there's advantages to reducing the Q environment, all right? And actually, one of the conclusions at the very end of the talk, when we get to the conclusions of this whole study, or a series of studies, one of the advantages is that, and we use a reduced Q environment in some of our studies, is that if I'm not looking at your face and your clothes and your jewelry and passing judgment on you, I direct my attention more to a task. Reduced Q environments increase the task focus, okay? The task focus. There are other, obviously, disadvantages of that. And we also want to talk about, or focus on, or I'll talk a little bit about some of the distinctions between dialogue and deliberation. Dialogue is a good word, it's fine, but I don't use it very much. It's a very popular word, and there's a lot written in the social sciences and in communication, in particular on dialogue. But dialogue sometimes takes on this sort of spiritual, authentic communication, open, honest, wrench your guts out, sort of aura. And I don't want to talk about the process like that. I mean, there's a place for that, and that's fine. It can have its value, and sometimes during solving conflicts, you just engage in conventional communication where you get to know the other person. And those kinds of things are a part of it. But it's not the main concern here. We, in these studies, which I'll talk about now, we'll go through some of the slides, and we in these studies used a variety of subjects and did a variety of kinds of analysis. And our theories were deliberation and democracy. So in the beginning here, we have some issues related to theories of democracy, and deliberation. I'm not going to go through all of these, except to give you an idea of some of the issues, all right? I always begin, and even I think in this book I just mentioned that came out a few weeks ago, the first sentence is that material and symbolic resources in the world are not equally distributed. All that means is that people are different. Somebody's smarter than me. Somebody runs faster. Somebody shoots a basketball better. Somebody can do math. Somebody can't do math. There's just differences, all right? And also cultures and countries, their weather, their land, their resources, they're not equally distributed. That simply makes for the politics of difference, and I tend to generally use the term politics as the management of those differences. The management of those differences. Differentiation is the norm, and groups seek to maximize their outputs and their outcomes, and interest-based positions, is the stuff of politics. A very powerful point with respect to democratic theory based on communication, and you probably are familiar with the literature, what's called deliberative democracy, which comes out of a political theory, and much of it is spilled into communication, sociology, and other areas. And deliberative democracy talks about the sense in which the way you solve problems is by argument, And that's essentially what we do. Israel is a good democracy and certainly solves its problems, or addresses its problems anyway, by argument. And the same thing is true, with the United States. And the term that is used is what's called a contestatory democracy. You just engage in argument. Argument, I don't know about you, but when I talk to argument with my students, something in the educational system these days has led them to believe that argument is not a good thing, that it's unpleasant. And I've even had students say, what do you want me to do, get mad at the person? Things like that. And we were talking about this a week or so ago. But argument is the tool, is the mechanism by which, differences, are expressed and problems are solved. Now, argument is controversial, and not everyone's good at argument. There are people who don't like argument. You could put together a deliberative structure on a website or something like that, and you have lots of people who are shy and don't speak well, and don't argue well, but you still have to include those people in the process. And if you're talking about solving problems peacefully and through communication, or getting to that point where you're using communication, you are talking about argument. I'm not naive. I understand violence and those stages of conflict where people despise each other so much they won't talk and won't have anything to do with anyone. But that's sort of not what I'm all about, or not what I'm talking about. That's something else that's important. But I want to talk about it, and I'm concerned with that point in time where you're at a hurting stalemate, which is a phrase used in the conflict resolution literature. The stalemate is so painful that you finally talk, or the two sides decide that they're going to, get together and try to work out some problems. These are various models of democracy. They're unimportant right now for our particular purposes. They're just there for general background. Representative democracy, which is skilled experts. All of us have in the United States as a representative democracy. You have it also. Participatory and discursive. Discursive is closer to what we're concerned with, which is reasoning together, in public. And those are all the theories of democracy. Discursive democracy is contestatory, right? It's based on hammering out interest-based differences, all right? And some people are well-trained in argument, others are not. Let me ask you a question. Is it typical in the lower levels of Israeli schools for students to get training in argument?
No, not at all.
That's what I thought. When I was in school, we did have a lot of that. Sound like an old fart, I know, but we did have a lot of that. But even in American schools, which they used to have courses in argument, and sometimes there still are, but much of that is passed now also. Much of that is now passed also.
We are in fact discouraged from arguing.
I'm sorry?
We are in fact discouraged from
Really?
arguing.
How so? How does that work?
Do what you're told.
Just do what you're told, really? Well, not arguing with a teacher, but I mean studying arguments and argument structures, etc.
It can bring bad ideas to kids.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate, but
There was never a teaching of argument in Israel, even in the old days.
in the old days, and they don't teach basic argument structures, syllogisms, and all that stuff out of logic and all that formal.
That's unique to America.
Yeah, okay, well, there's a fair amount of that taught in American systems, and I'm actually a strong supporter of that. But what's really interesting is, there's a distinction. I'm a little off topic, but I'll make this distinction quickly. There's a distinction in the literature on argument between making an argument and having an argument. All right? It's called argument one and argument two. Making an argument is an intellectual process. All right? Smart people are very good at making arguments, and we teach our students, I know, in the States who are interested in marketing, public relations, political communication, a lot about making an argument. I mean, that's what Netanyahu and his team do, and Obama and campaigns, and they're in the business of making arguments, okay? And you can't just make them up out of nothing. But in deliberation, you not only make arguments, but you have arguments. Having an argument is an interpersonal sort of experience. I have an argument with you. Arguing with somebody, who, is in a relationship with you is different than the formal structure. It's not like Platonic syllogisms and logical, logical arguments. It has more emotions and psychology and that sort of thing in there. Things that normally aren't considered part of good arguments become arguments for real human beings. That's an important part of this work, which is to include the arguments that people make on the basis of their culture, their nature, their differences. Okay, there's some references in here, and also in the book and a variety of other places, to the different ways in which Arabs argue versus Western cultures argue. Right? There's a woman by the name of Barbara Johnstone who's done some work on Arab argument structures, and their tendency to use repetition more, and not to be as structured as Western sort of arguments take place. I've worked with groups with Israelis and Palestinians in which we tried to have some input on managing and controlling the argument, and told that this is a Western imposition, that you're telling people to argue a way that you argue and it doesn't count, And that's a whole different other sorts of issues. Arguments are public, and the Habermasian ideal of participants being non-strategic. In argument literature, it's an important difference between being strategic, which is sitting down trying to win your case, trying to get what you want through argument, versus using argument to get the best ideas out and to learn the most. People in our culture, both of our cultures, selling products and selling politicians are in the business of strategic argument. Okay, deliberation, trying to solve problems in your neighborhood, is in the business of communicative argument, trying to work out problems. Go ahead.
I just remember that actually there is a teaching of argument in Israeli Jewish religious schools, which is Talmudic argument.
The Talmudic, yeah, there is. There's a long tradition of argument. Well, the stereotypes about Jews and argument and Jewish lawyers and all that sort of thing, I think come from those kinds of traditions of argument and sort of a Talmudic argument. But we want to try to achieve communicative participation. I wrote a book and published in 2006 in which I did a variety of interviews with 3 publics, in Israel. And I found that, and this book was called Transformative Communication, on communication that transforms, attitudes. And I found that when I was talking about peace, and I was asking these various members of these different cultures about peace, Israelis tended to use the language of security when they talked about peace, that no more terror, no more checkpoints, etc. Israeli Arabs tended to use the language of fairness when they talked about solutions to problems and peace, when we get enough money and are treated in the same way. And Palestinians tended to invoke the language of historical justice, law of return, all the issues in the case. And they were actually arguing from what are called 3 discursive paradigms, 3 different kinds of ways of thinking about the problem. Well, discursive democracy is deliberative. It can be deliberative. It's based on reciprocity. These are qualities of arguments. You want arguments to be reciprocal, so both sides engage in them, and engage in the act of justification. Let me give you an example from some of the data. Palestinian kid says, this checkpoint, this was near Tantur, near Jerusalem. This checkpoint is not for security, it's just to punish us. That was his claim. Okay? And the Israelis say, what do you mean? And the kid says, 10,000 people a day, workers, and secretly people go through this checkpoint. All right? And you stop us not because of security, but just to punish. It's punishment, not security. Okay. Now that's this person's argument. I'm not concerned at the moment about the truth value of that argument. That's another discussion. But that's their argument, that you're simply trying to punish us. You're not trying to really concerned about security. Those are the sorts of things that need to be justified. If you were truly trying to be more deliberative here, you'd have to justify these kinds of claims, which actually ends up being difficult. And you can see some of these issues about how deliberation transforms, perspectives and is oriented toward others. These are ideals. I grant you they're ideals. They're very often not achieved. You can't achieve every aspect ideally of deliberation, but you want to try. You want to try. Now, the deliberation is typically not associated. Much of the work that my colleagues and I have done is uniquely related to ethno-political conflicts. Deliberation is error reduction. It's not necessarily negotiation, all right? Negotiation is a style of communication, and it's perfectly fine, right? But you're usually trying to reduce errors, and there's lots of ways to do that, all right? Deliberation is good for groups that are, this is a mouthful, I know, in English, but it's called enclave polarization. Enclave. It simply means that increasingly in modern society, we live in our little groups. People who agree with us, people who think like us, and we're increasingly polarized. That's the term enclave polarization. It comes from a fellow by the name of Cass Sunstein. But enclave polarization really relies a lot on I'm sorry, go right ahead.
Sorry, I'm just trying to translate to English. About 2 things that you said. You said that when you have an argument, so the purpose is not just to, you said it differently, that it's not just to let the other one to think as I think, it's to listen to each other, to try to get to a point.
Ideally.
Okay. It's hard to me to understand how, if they don't listen to each other, they will listen to each other, but they don't really take that, because they just, as Tal mentioned again, that they just repeat what they said all the time. So how can you come in the end to some agreement to to, if everyone just said what they want and, okay, we said, we
You have to-
heard, and now what?
You have to find ways to get past that. You have to find ways to change, to get them to listen to you, you know, on the basis of your language, and you listen on their language. It's slow and difficult. I mean, imagine the religious person who says that the land was given to them by God. That's a pretty tough thing to talk about. You know, what do I do? Start arguing with them about God? I mean, that's kind of a waste of my time. So I have to start finding a way to get in. I've said this to people. You know, how do I talk to you? You know, and you have to use their own codes, their own language, their own environment. Maybe, you know, religious language. You have to use the documents that they value. You have to meta-communicate about it. You know, meta-communication is communication about communication, all right? And if two people are genuine, if you're really genuine and you're trying to solve some problems with me, we'll say, you know, here's how we're communicating with each other, and we'll recognize those problems and then move out of them from there. If you're not genuine, if you say, I believe what I believe and I have no interest in changing my mind, well then fine, there's no place for us to go. So you have to work on it like that. Anyway, enclave polarization is an important situation where people use deliberation. The United States is accused these days of a lot of enclave polarization. Democrats and Republicans, and who are more polarized, and they don't come together at all. The Republicans and the Democrats used to argue 50, 60 years ago and then have drinks together at the end of the day. That doesn't happen anymore. You know, that doesn't happen anymore. Very, very polarized, all right? And that's why you're seeing a lot of problems associated with that, because there is no discussion and no deliberation. Very little actually going on in the U.S. Congress. Let me give you one example here of trying to solve some problems. And again, I apologize, but this is the language. It's a little technically theoretical. It's called incomplete theorization. Incomplete theorization. Let me give you an example. What if a scientist who's a rigorous scientist, empirically based scientist, wants to save a small species of fish because that fish fits into the ecological cycle in some way, right? And that scientist wants to lobby Congress to save this little species of fish and prevent a bunch of construction, and it costs a lot of money. But we've got to save this little species of fish because it eats a certain bug, and it's part of the scientific ecology of the water, right? And then a religious person says, I want to save the same little fish because it's part of God's grace. Okay, the hardcore scientist and the religious person are working together on legislation to save this fish, but for different reasons. That's what incompletely theorized means. Lower the level of abstraction. Certainly don't go argue with the scientist about scientists and the religious person about religion, right? But lower the level of abstraction. Try to solve pragmatic issues, you know, on the ground. I think there's implications for these kinds of solutions and arguments, you know, for, you know, example, Israelis and Palestinians, which I'm not at yet. Yes, sir.
No, that's very interesting. What these ideas are in your recent book or the 06 book?
A recent book. The contact hypothesis, if you're not in the social sciences, is a very, very important phenomenon, which simply says that contact between conflicting groups and people with problems, you know, if the conditions are right and if it's done well enough, has a positive value. It doesn't guarantee it. You know, we all know, and I, as a communication professor, I'd be the last person to tell you that communication always makes us happier and friendlier. I can have communication with you and realize I don't like you. That's fine. And you could do the same thing for me, of course. That can happen in communication. But on the average, it doesn't. The social conformity strictures are strong enough that people actually do, you know, tend to like each other and come together a little bit more often than not. And that gets maximized even if, to the extent that you can manage the conditions of contact. This is a statistical model that we developed and tested out, the structural equation model. Very simply, it takes intergroup meetings. It took Israelis and Palestinians. I did this with a colleague at the Hebrew University. And they were looking for the likelihood of integrative solutions that integrated the issues of both sides. It satisfied you and satisfied me. Not me winning the argument or you winning the argument, but integrating with one another, all right? And the single path that's statistically significant, that's the most important thing that leads to integrative solutions, and you know this, is trust. if the two sides trust each other, if two people trust each other. You know that, but it is strong evidence for what you have to do to get to the point of getting quality solutions. And trust is an interpersonal sort of phenomenon. You know, you got to trust the person you're working with. There's a lot more very interesting work on the difference between, and I'm not going to go into it because I just don't have time, the difference between interpersonal issues, you know, I trust you, you trust me, and group level trust, right? We all have attitudes about ourselves. As you might say, as a Jew, do you feel vulnerable? And you might say, personally, do I feel vulnerable? No, I don't feel vulnerable. Do you think your group is vulnerable? And you might say, yeah, I do think they're vulnerable, all right? So you can have an attitude about yourself as a member of a group, you know, like an ethnic or a religious group, and the group itself, and the group itself. One of the things that does point out is that interpersonal relations generalize to the group. They don't guarantee it, but they generalize it. You know, if you're from another ethnic group and I'm from another ethnic group, if we have an interpersonal relationship, you know, and it's a quality one based on shared categories of interest, we tend to generalize it up to the group. Nothing magical about it. Doesn't mean I'm going to all of a sudden make all the problems go away, but it does improve the process of generalizing positively to the group. So trust is a very important factor here. I take a little shot here at peace education. It's okay. I mean, I've written a chapter for a book on peace education. Gabi Solomon at Haifa, you know that name? He's written a lot about peace education. But I make the distinction between peace education and what we're doing. Here's some data on the results of various kinds of contact in taking part in some studies. It's pretty simple. These are non-participants, and what they had to do was they had to read and study the narrative of the other side. And we had them read the two sides and try to learn something about each side's narrative. These were non-participants. You see there was no difference. You know, pre-test and post-test Israelis, no difference. But you can see what happens here in the post-test with the participants in this study. Okay? Both sides, you know, increase positive responses. So the act of an Israeli Jew learning about the narrative of the Palestinian unfreezes him a little bit. And the same thing with the Palestinian. Again, it doesn't mean they don't, 5 minutes after the experiment, doesn't mean they don't go back to where they started. And just like Seeds of Peace, you know that organization, you probably heard that they bring kids from the conflicts, you know, to camp in Maine in the United States. And their data shows that once they go back home, especially the Israelis go into the military, etc., they resort pretty much to similar sort of attitudes, all right? So, I mean, these things do change, and there's nothing magical about them. But for starters, they are making some progress. This is the same kind of data on advocating war, as opposed to participants in a sort of peace education kind of a process.
And this is, if I understand correctly, Palestinians advocating more war. I didn't understand what it means.
In the post-test, right? In the post-test, after the Palestinians did advocate more war when they didn't participate in the attempt to teach them about the other side. I want to show you what we did in terms of analyzing this very specific issues of argument. Very specific issues. We devised a coding scheme, and we tested some theories. On the basis of some of these issues, we made some predictions about how they should argue. Okay? Dugri and Musayara, right? Israeli, you know, Tamar Katriel of Haifa University has written a very important book on Israeli Dugri speech, and Musayara is the counterpoint of its communication style, right, for the Arab cultures, all right. And Israelis, of course, you would expect, you know, to be more argumentative, all right. That's part of the cultural stereotype. That's part of the Israeli Dugri speech. That's part of what you would expect. And for the Palestinians to be more Musayara, which means to go along and get along. And we just use a variety of these things to make predictions. Okay? There's another theory of, one of the theories was that the way they talk to their speech styles, communication styles, like Dugri and Musayara, you know, makes a difference. Right? Another theory is what's called minority-majority theory. Right? This is a theory that says minorities, the Palestinians in this case, usually take an advantage of the opportunity and do better in communication situations because it's a situation in which they have more control. And they're not weak, if they're capable of it, they can argue, they can verbalize, and they use the situation to get what they want. And we do find that in this data. The stereotypes about more assertive, argumentative-based Jews actually doesn't hold. The Jews and the Israeli Jews in these data kick back, quite a bit. Now, there's reasons for that also that are not part of the study. Part of it is who takes part in these things. I can't get hardcore conservative religious people to take part very much. So most of them are a little bit liberal anyway, right? So that's a bit of a problem. But you do find that, in the minority. Israelis are more defensive. Communication is a way for minorities to be heard and exercise power. Minorities tend to like communication situations because they tend to exercise power. What we did is we got some data. We used it, got it on the internet. We worked with Gershon Baskin. You probably know him at IPCRI. We got some data with him, in which we had Israelis and Palestinians discussing issues and arguing on the internet. We then take their utterances. They worked in English, which also has its problems, but the only way I could do the coding is if they worked in English.